Hello and welcome to this April 2020 podcast from Le Monde Diplomatique. My name is George Miller, and my guest in this programme is Jon Bird, who's an artist, writer, curator, and emeritus professor of art and critical theory at Middlesex University. In the April edition of the paper, Jon writes about the artist and filmmaker Steve McQueen, who had a major retrospective at Tate Modern in London until the gallery was suddenly closed because of COVID-19. McQueen, who turned 50 last year, has had an immensely successful career by any measure. Since winning the Turner Prize in 1999 for his early explorations of the moving image, he's gone on to direct 4 feature films, the most recent, Widows, in 2018, and, in 2014, 12 Years a Slave, for which he received the Oscar for Best Picture, becoming the first black recipient of that award. But McQueen has by no means abandoned the gallery for the movie theatre, as you'll hear, and as his recent exhibition showed. Before we got on to that, I asked Jon to fill in some background about McQueen's career before the 1999 Turner Prize.
He was an art student. He was at Chelsea, first of all, Chelsea School of Art, and then he went on to the Goldsmiths College, University of London, in the beginning of the 1990s. He was a student at Goldsmiths from 90 to 94. As you know, the Goldsmiths is the London Art School that is most closely associated with what became known as the YBAs, the Young British Artists. It produced quite a few of them, including, of course, Damien Hirst. So he comes out of a background of visual arts practice. He, I think, became interested in photography and film and video work at art school, and that became his medium of expression. I think for quite a lot of artists of that period of the early 90s, late 80s and early 90s, it wasn't just that film and video offered, to some extent, a kind of different way. It offered a new way of working. It was a break with the more traditional past activities of painting, sculpting. So he did that. He had a brief period in New York where he studied at New University. But then it's interesting that his work was picked up actually really quite early on. I mean, I think not only when he was at college, but very soon afterwards in the early 90s, he was in a way noted as one of the most original, most interesting students coming out of that Goldsmiths background. And he started making black and white videos. One particularly, which is called Bear, which is in 1993, where he filmed himself naked wrestling with another nude male. And in a way, that very early work indicated, I think, themes that were recurrent throughout his practice, because it is the black male body and often the nude male body which is the focus and has been the focus of his practice throughout all of those years, and has also, of course, that interest in the body, and often the body in extreme states, you know, in exhaustion or violence or eroticism, is in a way a kind of signature style. He also, another work, Deadpan, which I think is probably one of his best-known works because it's also quite amusing. He took a Buster Keaton stunt where Keaton stands and the house collapses around him and he's left standing as he happens to be fortunately in the position where the open window is. And McQueen repeats that. So you also, I think, through his practice, get a constant reference to cinema. There was one of the films in the exhibition, the one called Charlotte, where it's a 10-minute film of the actress Charlotte Rampling, where Steve McQueen is stroking her face with his fingers, and they're kind of coming very close to the eye. They're tracing the eyelid and the eyelashes, and at one point actually almost seem to make contact with the eyeball. And of course, if you know about film, then that's going to make a connection to Buñuel's film, Un Chien Andalou, of the slitting of the eyeball. So there is that dialogue that goes on, I think, which of course is the case with any artist. I mean, art comes out of art, and influence will always find its way through into practice. But with Steve, I say there is that kind of constant reference to both mainstream but also independent cinema and new wave cinema.
In preparation for talking to you today, Jon, I was looking at some interview material that Steve McQueen had done through the years, and I saw him talking about, back in the early days, sensing a frustration about being unable to make feature films. And I was quite surprised at that even quite early on in his career, I had always sort of seen the use of film in the art gallery has been quite a sort of separate domain from the making of feature films, and perhaps that was my misperception. But to hear him enunciate that rather surprised me.
Well, I think in a way it's significant that he did say that, and I think it's significant that he's one of the very few artists, filmmakers, who has made that step through into mainstream cinema. Artists' use of film and video is quite different to filmmakers, where different aspects of the kind of materiality of film. I mean, Tacita Dean is another artist, I guess, who comes to mind, who I think in some respects is similar to Steve in her interest in the materiality of film,
yes,
and the process, but is somebody who I don't think, well, she hasn't really kind of tried to make that step into mainstream cinema, and I'm not sure she'd be that interested in doing it. Although I think with Steve, it was probably a sense of, you have a much bigger audience. It's a very different audience.
Yes, and I mean that suggests that that there is a strong desire on his part to reach an audience, and beyond that to communicate a message. Is that pushing things too far, to see him as, having a sort of sense of something he wants to get across to a mainstream audience?
I don't think as an artist with an agenda.
Right.
And I think his film, the narrative, very much comes out of the process of working with the material. And to some extent, I mean, obviously not entirely, because if you do go into mainstream cinema, then narrative is pretty important.
Sure.
You need to engage and hold your audience,
yes,
for a particular period of time. But even those films, I mean, with Hunger, the very, very long sequence of Bobby Sands in the jail talking to the priest, and that is all that's happening in a way. And that seems to me that's very much an artist's take on a kind of almost like a soliloquy or a two-person, almost like a conceptual artwork, in fact. And I think you get it a bit in 12 Years a Slave as well, the kind of interaction between the characters, particularly in the kind of violence that goes on. There's almost a sense of what happens if two bodies come together in a confrontation. I'm sure, of course, they are carefully scripted, and I don't think it's somebody like, I don't know, Ken Loach or somebody like that who just, more or less allows actors to improvise. I think he's pretty directorial in his role. But it's still, if we create this, what will happen? And that's very much the kind of sense that you get, with the artist films.
Yes. So, I mean, it's experimental in that sense, even when he is, apparently working in the mainstream. There's something, I remember that scene in Hunger where it's a fixed camera for, I think, a good 30 minutes. And there's something mesmerizing and rather fearless on the part of the filmmaker, isn't there?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think that, that if you know about artist films in the kind of, over the last 20, 30 years, and you see a McQueen major movie, one of the 4 movies, then I think you do get a sense of this is a visual artist who is making a film, as at the same time because he is an artist who is able to, deal with the mechanics of mainstream cinema, you are carried along by a very powerful narrative, of course.
Yes. And so not at all contemptuous of narrative. I mean, this may just be my prejudice, but I often get the impression that video installations and art galleries don't really have a great deal of interest or time for narrative.
I think it depends on the maker. It very much depends on the maker, but I think you can get a great deal of film and video work, artist film and video work over the last sort of 30 years or so, which doesn't convey that urgency, that movement. There doesn't even seem to be that much interest in the mise-en-scène, things like that. It's more or less, it's almost like conceptual art in front of the camera. But yes, his difference, and I mean that was the case, I think, even with his early films. I mean, he introduced sound in the sort of late 90s, where he was rolling these tin drums around the streets of New York, and you get the sound of the rolling drum coming through. But and he had this, he had an exhibition early on at the ICA of a kind of mini retrospective, which was very early, really. I mean, it's he's still, relatively young in terms of a major career, given what he's achieved in this period.
And looking at a piece like Western Deep, which is in the show that's been at the Tate Modern until it was closed because of the coronavirus.
Yeah.
The sound there is a very important part. It's a descent into the deepest gold mine in the world. And I guess it's imaginable to have it as a silent film, but when you hear the sound, the rumbles and the squeaks and the machinery, it's a very, very powerful part of the whole impression that it makes, isn't it?
It does do that, and it is. I mean, I think I talked in the piece about he's a very kind of phenomenological filmmaker, that he's very interested in the tactility of seeing. And you get that, particularly with Western Deep, because when it's blown up from, Super 8 to the large screen, then you're very also aware of the pixelation. And you have to strain, really, both in terms of, sound and in terms of vision, to kind of make out what's happening. These murky figures kind of emerging out of the darkness, and the way in which the soundtrack suddenly goes silent as they stagger around, and then it starts up again. So you do identify, I think, very powerfully with the claustrophobia of the experience of going down, over 2 miles in this little cage to work at the coalface to extract the ore. And I almost felt your hands sweating at the end of seeing that, because you're sort of on the edge of your seat. Yes. Looking at the image, and it's, yes, I mean, it is a body experience as well as a visual experience.
Yes, and again, you've got bodies of mainly black men in a precarious place, an environment which is threatening, which is hostile to them.
Yes, it's a place of restraint.
Yes.
They are entrapped in that, and of course, behind it is the whole, complex history of colonialism, etc., that goes to why is it certain people do certain jobs. And although, I mean, in a way, that's why I think he doesn't have an agenda. I mean, I think an artist who was more interested in, in the obvious political message would have gone into that more. Whereas I think with McQueen, to some extent, you have to work at it. Mm. You have to work to get the movie, to get the image, to get the narrative, but you also, in a way, have to work through the different layers that are all there, because they're there in the narrative, they're there in the mise-en-scène, they're there in the different component parts of the image at any one sort of moment on the screen. But you have to kind of uncover it. You have to pick it apart.
So if you're saying that he doesn't have an overt agenda, is it nonetheless possible to say that there are recurrent things which fire his imagination as a filmmaker? I
think there are, and I think we've touched on them. I think certainly, that history, the history of the slave trade, what Paul Gilroy refers to as the Black Atlantic, of the incarceration, oppression and violence done to the body. I think those are very much there. And of course that's, 12 Years a Slave is the most obvious example of that. But I think also the idea of, both the extremes of bodily sensation. Everything from, the two figures wrestling, where you feel the tension, the weight of the body, the sweat coming off the body, is the way in which one is trying to, sort of throw the other one, that sort of sense of interlocked figures. You get it with the touch of Charlotte Rampling on the eye. You get it with the physicality of Western Deep. I mean, you even get it in the sort of in something, well, of course, in the one of Marcus who shoots his brother, where, you're faced with this skull, this recumbent figure where the camera is placed shooting directly onto the skull, which is the head, which is filling the screen with this scar going across it. You're constantly thinking, how did that happen? What caused that? What was the pain that was involved in doing that? How did he come out of it alive? How do I relate this to the story that is being told about this accidental, act that ends a life? So I think, yes, I mean, there are definite themes, there are definite tropes, definite images almost that repeat. But I think that the body in pain, the body in pleasure are central to his practice.
Do you think that Steve McQueen himself makes no distinction between his more mainstream cinema and the films that you see in galleries? Does he see it as all of a piece, or how do you know how he would characterize these different modes that he works in? Because it's clear from what you're saying there are recurrent themes and approaches in both.
I would think from looking at the work, I don't think it's a complete disconnect in any means. I don't think it's a matter of saying, okay, I've got a year's project of making a Hollywood movie and that's what I'm going to be as a director or an auteur. Yeah. And then now, I've got an exhibition coming up, I'm going to make 3 artist films. I don't think it's like that at all. And I think also, I would imagine, and one could probably, if you really studied the work, you could see how the experience of mainstream cinema then feeds back into the making of an artist film. It's a two-way process. I mean, with any kind of practice, it's the same person doing it. I think that also they're very different kinds of activities. In artist films, even, kind of quite big budget artist films, someone thinks of somebody like Bill Viola, doing some of his films. It's mostly a person with a camera and a subject. You may use the kind of, others may help, there's sound technicians, things like that going in, but basically that's what it is. Once you're into mainstream cinema, it's a team. It's a big, big team, and you are part of that. And you take, very much a kind of overseeing directorial role rather than the intimate maker's role that I think you get as an artist making a film.
And once you've made an Oscar-winning film, even, before you win the Oscar, there's a lot of money riding on, isn't there? So there are people who feel very much that they need to have a view on what you're putting out. Yeah, no, very much so. And I think equally for women, for black artists, for black filmmakers, it's always been a tough call. So you're up against all of those things as well. I mean, I think certainly Steve, the fact that he'd won the Turner, he had that reputation as, as an artist who could do, major projects, that would have helped. But even so, it's still a huge jump to go from that to, a big budget production. Jon, before we finish, I wanted to talk about an exhibition which was running at the same time as the Tate Modern one, which was on at Tate Britain, is called Year 3. And it's a little bit different from the film projects we've been talking about. Can you say something about that and how you sort of see it fitting into McQueen's career?
It is different. He spent a year with assistants going round London schools, both inner and greater London schools, primary schools, to take photographs of children in Year 3, which is basically children who are around about 8 years old. He said he chose that age because that's the point at which, and anyone who's had children will know this, is the point at which children are starting to, in a way, separate from the intimacy of the family and start to encounter the broader world. It's like their horizons are beginning to change. The intention really was to investigate the diversity of one of the world's great capital cities through its children. And that is the thing. I mean, there are things I think one could say about the layout. I mean, it's at Tate Britain rather than at Tate Modern. It occupied the Devine Galleries, which are the major galleries on the ground floor in Tate Britain. It's photographs displayed in grid form throughout the whole of the Devine Galleries. And in that respect, there are things about it that I think also make reference to aspects of contemporary conceptual photography. I mean, you think of the role of the grid in contemporary art. You think of people like Bernard and Hilla Becker, who did those endless series of shots of German industrial sites, things like that. So it has those kinds of connections there. But it is about these children, and they're everything from kind of quite small groups to large groups. Mostly they have a teacher or a couple of teachers and assistants in the group. Some are in school uniforms, some are just in, their everyday clothes. They're all face to camera, so they engage with you. It's stacked high because there's, 76,000 images there. It's an awful lot of pictures. But it's a document of the diversity of London. I think it is a powerful, powerful statement. And I think it's a hopeful statement. What is the utopic side of education? Education is for everyone. And when it comes down to, a group of kids, 8 years old in a class, the potential is there, and they're all the same. It is a remarkable work. I don't think it's great art in the way in which I think some of his other works are. I think they will always stand as the cliche, the test of time. But I think as an imaginative imaging of London as a truly, cosmopolitan city from its youngest inhabitants, it is a wonderful work.
Do you see the influence of McQueen everywhere?
Not so obviously. I think after this exhibition, more so, because bear in mind, I say his last exhibition was in the 90s at the ICA, so we're major exhibition. We're quite a long time on for that. There are a lot of students who, of course, have continued to go and investigate the moving image, either through film or video, or now increasingly, of course, through the digital media.
Yes.
I mean, I have some of my own students for whom it's, the digital media is the area to go if you want to work with the moving image. In a way, that's a task for future historians to plot McQueen's influence. But there's no doubt that he has had an influence, and certainly he has a wide public, and he's been able to, reach through his step over into mainstream cinema a very, very large audience. So I would hope that people who have seen his main films might have, well, not now, but anyway, might have been encouraged to, I wonder what else he's done. And similarly, those who, just know him as an artist filmmaker would have thought, well, I better check out these movies too. There is a huge amount to explore. It's a very rich body of practice.
I was talking to Jon Bird about his article in the April 2020 edition of Le Monde Diplomatique, entitled Looking Without Blinking. Jon's article is also available on the website at mondediplo.com. If you're a subscriber, you can read every edition of the paper going back over 20 years, as well as exploring other resources such as maps, images, the podcast archive, and online exclusive content. And if you're not yet a subscriber, there's plenty of content online to entice you to become one, and full details on how to go about it. In the words of the late Jon Bird, why read LMD? To make sense of what's happening in the world, behind the misinformation. I hope you'll join me again next month for another interview with one of our contributors. Until then, thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.